Like I've said before, the distinction of greatest video game of all time is not one that is handed out lightly, but over the years, the gaming community has developed an informal shorthand list. This includes games like Bloodborne, beautiful, Sons of Liberty, beautiful, Mother 3, beautiful, Mario 64, beautiful, Chrono Trigger, alright, Bioshock, okay, The Last of Us, The Witcher 3, no. I've always wanted to play every single game in that colloquial top tier, which brings me to the game of the hour. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is one of those legendary golden age video games that consistently comes up in conversations surrounding the greatest video games ever made, which is why it brings me great shame to confess that I have never actually beaten it until today. Ever since I noticed the internet, it's been impossible to ignore because of how widely beloved it is. But because it's a Super Nintendo game, it was before my time. If you're my age, the Super Nintendo library is kinda like the video game equivalent of that one aunt that babysat you when you were 2 and expects you to recognize her now that you're a teenager even though you haven't seen her in over a decade. When I was a little baby kid, I had Ocarina of Time, which is the other greatest video game ever made, and even that was a game I played sparingly back then. It was mostly the rest of my family that was into it, although I would sometimes go into their files and fight re-deads and waste all their arrows and then die. Back then, most of these adventure games, if you want to call them that, were just way too complicated for me. The games I would play were usually stuff like Mario 64, Kirby 64, and Mario Kart, and the important common ground that all of these games share is that they are all fundamentally simple enough that they don't require any instructions whatsoever. There are instructions and tutorials in these types of games, but I didn't really need them because the games practically explain themselves. I mean, you ask what is the goal of Mario Kart, like, are you stupid? All of this is to say that the games I opted for did not require any amount of reading whatsoever. To be clear, it wasn't that the core mechanics of Zelda were too complicated, it's just that the objectives required to progress the game were very specific and elaborate and were usually tied to the narrative, which means it requires you to actually pay attention to the dialogue. This wouldn't have been so bad, except that I actively refused to read any of the dialogue in any video game because I was a little baby kid. Whenever I did try to play games like this, I would always end up skipping all the dialogue boxes and just gravitated towards whatever I thought would be the most fun, which was usually just hitting stuff with a sword. But inevitably I would get lost and confused and not know where to go and what to do, and then I said, well, this game is ass. Then I'd shut it off so I could play a real game, like Earthworm Jim 3D. Suffice it to say, I really didn't get it. It wasn't until it was re-released on the Wii's Virtual Console a few years later that I tried it again, and that time it stuck. Turns out that all those words that are in the game are actually kind of important. I'd finally come to understand the value in that kind of game design. It makes you feel like you're actually on an adventure, learning all kinds of interesting things from the locals and being rewarded for your curiosity and attention. Something I was tragically unaware of at the time, though, is that Ocarina was, in all likelihood, the most easy Zelda game to come out at that point by every conceivable metric. Whether it was the combat or the puzzles or the navigation, OOT was far more accessible and less punishing than the previous titles. And to some extent, that does make sense, right? 3D was a very new thing at the time, so they had to ease into it. For a while, Ocarina was considered to be not only the greatest 3D Zelda title, but also the greatest Zelda title in general, and possibly the greatest game of all time by extension. Similarly, I get the sense that Link to the Past is often considered to be the best 2D Zelda, and also, by extension, another contender for the greatest game of all time. So considering how important this game is, this video is me taking care of long unfinished business. This video is closure for me. And I gotta be honest with you, the sad truth about Link to the Past and most of its contemporaries is that somebody like me, in my position, who was raised in the third dimension and only really went back to the Super Nintendo later in life, only after being spoiled by the technical and artistic splendor enabled by modern hardware, was probably never going to love this game the way somebody who was playing it back in 91 or 92 would. AVGN put it best in his Final Fantasy VI video when he said that there is only room for so many games to make that kind of tremendous impact on you. And for me, I knew going in that whatever room was left in that museum was probably not going to be occupied by a 2D Zelda game that I only went through and beat for the first time 30 years after it came out. But you know what? It's good. Yeah, it might even be great by some metrics. And considering it's a generation older than Ocarina, I am impressed at how not frustrating it is. Most of the time. We've come a very long way from the first Zelda titles, and Link to the Past was an incredibly important evolutionary step, having introduced the incredible innovation of actually allowing the player to beat the game without buying Nintendo Power. And the games have only become more accessible ever since. I mean, keep in mind, before everybody had Google, Nintendo used to literally have a telephone hotline where you'd call them up and some nerds would tell you how to beat the game. That's right, these games were often so obtuse that they literally created jobs. Those guys must have been pissed when GameFAQs dropped. When people say Zelda today, they're usually talking about Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and while I strongly feel that those are some of the best video games to come out in the last 10 years, I think there is a little bit of confusion as to what actually makes those games so special. You'll hear a lot of people say that Breath of the Wild was special because it was, in a way, a return to the old style of Zelda games, which were very open and self-directed adventures that don't talk your ear off and instruct you to oblivion. Games where you had to figure out everything on your own and kind of fuck around and find out on your own terms, but that's only half the story. The thing that really makes Breath of the Wild special, at least to my way of thinking, is not just that it is open and self-directed, but also that every single little part of the map was somehow important, so when you found yourself wandering around the world for an hour, it never felt like you were just spinning your wheels because there was always something helpful or at the very least interesting. Everything was building towards something else, and ultimately, in the end, will help you in your quest to defeat Ganon, or Calamity Ganon, or Mr. Dr. Ganon Esquire, or whatever. While that's technically also true of the old Zeldas with all their secret boxes and whatnot, Breath of the Wild also heavily scaled back the inflexible successive progression blocks of the older titles, meaning that there are very few instances of, oh no, you can't go there yet, you didn't get the sparkly gauntlets, did you talk to this NPC yet? Oh, you haven't even done the chicken wing trading quest, what are you even doing with your life, you little green bitch? Very rarely will you find a cool thing in Breath of the Wild, only to realize that you can't do anything with it because the game doesn't want you to be there yet, and there are a lot of puzzles that have more than one solution because the game knows and expects that you might try to experiment. It doesn't twist your arm into doing things in some kind of prescribed correct way. Because of these factors, never have I spent an hour playing Breath of the Wild and said, well, that was a waste of time. To me, that is the thing that makes Breath of the Wild so special. And ironically, it is the one thing that is not even remotely close to true of the old Zeldas. The thing about these old Zelda games is that they operate on a very strict and rigid order of operations to get to the end credits, which is pretty regular for a video game, but in a world this open, this structure can lead to frequent back-to-back dead stops in progression as you get lost or didn't read the text carefully enough or missed a visual cue that the developers probably thought was obvious. With few exceptions, everything has one solution, and that solution depends on the successive lineage of solutions up to that point. It's funny, in the beginning I spoke about how I couldn't play these games as a kid because I refused to read the text, but sometimes I find myself playing these games as an adult, and I'm still getting stuck even after reading the text with a microscope. This is not at all a bad thing, and it's obviously subjective to each player, but it can yield the consequence of frequently getting stuck. If you play these games and then stop playing and come back after more than 2 weeks, you could be really hosed. Unless you've been keeping very careful track of what you should be doing next, you could dig yourself a grave, and it could be very hard to get out. Of course, since I was recording my entire playthrough, I can just consult the footage. The old 2D Zelda games are a lot like Metroid in that they are 9-hour games that take most players more than 20 hours because we're stupid. And as a direct causal result of being so stupid, we keep getting lost like a stupid dumbass idiot who is stupid. Even though a lot of this is true of Link to the Past, I have played the NES titles as well, which given its place in the evolutionary timeline of the series, I feel strongly is the best reference point, and in contrast to those, this game is actually pretty straightforward. Playing any of these games for the first time can be frustrating due to these factors, but upon subsequent playthroughs when you remember where everything is, it's a lot easier to appreciate the fun moments. I beat this game in like 22 hours, although 5 of those was me not realizing I was supposed to use the fire rod here. Playing Link to the Past all this time later actually reminded me a lot of when I finally played Ocarina all the way through all those years ago. In Ocarina, all the stupid puzzles that I got stuck on are now permanently burned into my memory for when I inevitably revisit the game for the 1000th time, like when you have to raise the water level because they hid a secret room under this platform. Back then, it took me like an hour to find that shit. Link to the Past is much the same in that when I revisit the game in the future, I will be thinking about these moments so I can beat it more efficiently. Of course, it's not like you don't have any help. Even the NES titles gave you hints and clues as to where to look for important items or dungeons, although Link to the Past will spoil you with hints that are actually somewhat helpful. The NES games were like, "There's an old lady in the fucking place. Buy Nintendo Power." Link to the Past strikes a pretty good balance with its clues, giving you this really sweet Mode 7 map telling you where the next dungeon is, and half the time, the challenge is physically getting there and figuring out the puzzle to gain entrance instead of hopelessly wandering around with a piece of information that vaguely resembles a hint, praying that you're going in the right direction, which you are absolutely not. Smoothing out a lot of those rougher edges seems to be one of Link to the Past's greatest strengths. For a game that is somehow older than I am, if you can even comprehend that, it's a lot more polished than I expected. By modern standards, it's entirely playable. It's fluid and responsive in a way that the NES titles can barely even graze. It's always special to play a game this old and not immediately want to eat the controller. Although there are still some frustrating moments like the terrible swimming controls or getting screwed over by the cliff sides in tight spaces. Oh yeah, Nintendo, that's exactly what I wanted to do, thank you. Link to the Past is definitely a challenging game. The first half is alright, but in the back half it ramps up surprisingly quickly. There are parts of this game where the only way to get through them without having an aneurysm is to hunt down every single upgrade you possibly can and walk around with 4 fairies on hand at all times, and to some extent that's kind of a good thing because it further encourages you to explore this world and finish off all the side quests. The challenge makes the rewards you get so much more important and meaningful because that little shield upgrade could easily be the difference between getting through a dungeon on the first try and having your entire night ruined. I've been able to observe a very similar phenomenon in the Souls games, although this game came out decades earlier, so you'd better show your respect, Souls boys. If the combat looks simple, that's because it is, but it's deceptively simple. I often felt like I had to be so precise with when I decided to swing the sword and where I should swing it from to be able to do literally anything without getting hit by the enemy. It's all about positioning and timing in a game where everything is designed to knock you off a cliff. Even the recoil of hitting somebody else with a sword can push you over the edge. It's a very frequent point of frustration, and I think Donkey put it best when he described Link as being like a pinball in this game. And when you hit the Ice Palace, which combines all of that crap with slippery floors and these assholes that do 4 hearts of damage, you will never stop wanting to dump bacon grease down every Nintendo employee's sink drain. There is, however, a cool trick you can do with a lot of the enemies where you just hold your sword out in front of you and either walk into them or wait for them to walk into you, phalanx style. It's kinda dumb, but sometimes it really is the best option. And it's still better than NES Zelda. Exploration is, as it always has been in Zelda, the real star of the show. Both the light and dark world are full of secrets and hidden treasures that are often not necessary to complete the game, but are extremely conducive to doing so. and they require you to engage with the level design to a degree that might not be immediately obvious. Even within dungeons, there are things you can super easily miss that can help you big time, like the game even having the decency to let you fill up on fairies halfway through the dungeon because they know your bitch ass is gonna be falling off every single cliff before you even find the boss. But in terms of gameplay, the most dramatic step up with this game is in its tools and puzzle solving. Obviously, it feels quaint in contrast to the later titles, which is to be expected. Although this game did invent the hookshot, it has a clever way of nudging you in the direction of solutions without outright telling you anything. Like when they put this heart piece on top of this mountain so you swap to the Dark World, walk on top of it, and swap back. Visually, Super Nintendo graphics tend to age pretty well in contrast to the generation that followed, and this game has a very deliberate and effective art direction. Characters are expressive, environments are animated, it's a well-defined world with a lot of distinct biomes and visual variety. The boss fights are a really nice showpiece with these giant detailed imposing monsters with all kinds of moving parts, and they all have a certain puzzle to beating them, typically corresponding to the new thingy that you got in the dungeon. It's all great, but the real star of the show is the soundtrack. The music in this game is so good that several tracks have been cemented into my brain for years, despite only ever having played the game extremely sparingly until now. Numerous tracks would be referenced in future titles, and they even used it in the Scott Pilgrim movie. Like, several times. They got that upbeat Hyrule Field music. They got that ominous dark music for the dark and stormy night where everything goes wrong. Then there's my favorite track, which plays in Hyrule Castle. This is exactly what it sounds like in your head when you infiltrate a castle. I remember when I played Elden Ring for the first time, this song was literally in my head for half the game. Then we have the story. Now, despite the praise I've heard for the story, I found the plot of the game wasn't too much to write home about. It's a story about a bad guy and then a chosen good guy who beats the bad guy and then the good guy wins because he's the good guy. There is an undeniable dark element to it, with one of the first things happening being the death of your uncle, among others, although at the end, all of that stuff is kinda just undone because Link made a wish. At the end of every Dark World dungeon, one of the 7 maidens gives you another expository monologue explaining a little bit more about what the story is, although it doesn't ultimately change that much. It's not weird and subversive like Link's Awakening or aggressively discomforting like Majora's Mask. It's a straightforward and inoffensive story, but it hits the basic notes that you would expect from a story like this, and it presents them with a level of audiovisual prestige that could never have been achieved on the NES. It's a Nintendo game from the early 90s, so it's what it is, and it's hard to complain about happy endings, especially nowadays. Of course, a lot of the praise this game gets was made in the context of its original release, and in 30-something years, the ceiling for video game storytelling has risen quite dramatically, which applies not only to the gaming medium broadly, but also to Zelda specifically. And some of those leaps in storytelling actually happened during the Super Nintendo era with RPGs that came out not long after Link to the Past. I think the most interesting part of the story is the journey rather than the actual plot specifics. It's everything that is shown to you rather than told to you, like the stark contrast between the light and the dark world, exploring 2 different versions of the same world. That was easily the most interesting part of the game, both from the standpoint of gameplay and storytelling. It's such a great idea that they actually revisited it in Ocarina of Time with the 7-year time skip. Ocarina's world after the time skip is similarly destitute, often devoid of life and overrun by malevolent forces. While my personal feeling is that Ocarina did it better, I wonder if it would have been that way if Link to the Past didn't even try it beforehand. All the people are gone or transformed into inhuman creatures. The once majestic lost woods are now a literal boneyard. The water is murky, almost suggesting pollution, and even the trees are trying to kill you. I didn't realize I was playing Kirby. The Dark World is so hopelessly devoid of life that they don't even respect the dead. The graveyard is just a bunch of rocks. It even leverages the gameplay to help illustrate this. Traversing the Dark World is far more tedious and involved because the design of the world is actively and deliberately hostile and segmented. It is a land that has been quite literally divided and subsequently conquered. This contrast between the light and dark world is the real crown jewel of the story, serving as a stark warning of what's to come if Link should fail. And that's what keeps you going. It's the quest to prevent this from happening. So now we arrive at the end, and there's only one question left to ask. Is Link to the Past the greatest game of all time? Yeah, I don't think so. In its historical context, however, I fully understand how that could be in contention. The NES titles were already considered legendary when they came out, and this one improved upon every single aspect of them to the point that it's still playable today without having a stroke. Tons of people think this game holds up great today, and now that I've beaten it, it's kinda hard to disagree. It's in that sweet spot where it's old enough to be classic, but modern enough to age gracefully. The thing about the greatest game of all time designation when applied to games from the Super Nintendo era is that so much of video game territory was still hugely unexplored at that time. So when somebody tells me that the greatest video game of all time is a Super Nintendo game, whether it's Link to the Past or Final Fantasy 3, 6 or Chrono Trigger or Donkey Kong Country 2, I'm always gonna be skeptical just on pure instinct. At this point, I've been pretty upfront about not having that much attachment to the Super Nintendo era, but despite that lack of attachment, I think this game is more than worth playing, which begs another question. Should Link to the Past get a remake? Maybe? It is a little bit redundant since it's already available through NSO, although that also applies to Link's Awakening. Thing is, every video game is getting re-released and remade now. Thousand Year Door, Mario RPG, Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4, Snake Eater, and Unreal 5. In spite of my occasional frustrations with this game, there is very little about it that is in desperate need of ironing out. A graphical overhaul with new remixed versions of the already great soundtrack would be appreciated, but it's something that I wouldn't lose sleep over. In its original state, it still holds up surprisingly well, and maybe sometimes it's better to just let the past be as it is, untouched in its beautiful imperfections, until the cartridge fucks up and deletes your file.